Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon what time zone you're in. My name is Sharon Megdal. I'm Director of the Water Resources Research Center at the University of Arizona, and I'm delighted to have the honor of introducing this very important panel. And I appreciate the ASU Water Institute welcoming the Water Center at the University of Arizona as a co-host of this event. I want to ask everybody in the audience to please keep yourself muted during the panel discussion. And I'll note that if you have questions along the way and want to put them in the chat, please do so. I'll be monitoring those. And if we have time for questions, I will come back on screen and moderate the questions on behalf of the panel. Otherwise, after I do the introductions, I'll sign off and turn my camera off. But again, it's my pleasure to introduce this panel, this webinar, Poisoning the Well, How Forever Chemicals Contaminated America. And we have a really great lineup of panelists today. We have the two authors of the book of that title, Sharon Udasin, who's an environmental reporter and co-author of the book. Based in Boulder, Colorado, Sharon has been delving into water contamination and conservation issues for 15 years. And I guess, Sharon, I met you when you were a baby reporter because we met way back in 2011 over when you were covering environmental issues for the Jerusalem Post. Rachel Frazin covers energy and environmental policy for The Hill and is also the co-author of the book. At The Hill, she reports on everything from climate change to gasoline prices to toxic chemicals to renewable energy. And then we're really fortunate to have three activists, the protagonists of the book here with us. We have Brenda Hampton, who is a humanitarian activist and longtime resident of Lawrence County, Alabama, where she became the driving force behind a 2015 investigation into local PFAS contamination. And you'll hear more about that, of course, during the panel. We also have with us Mark Favors, who's born and raised in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And he tells me that's where he is right now, and the backdrop looks like that. But he's currently living in New York City. Mark is a U.S. Army veteran and a critical care registered nurse. And then we also have Liz Rosenbaum, who's a dedicated clean water advocate and the founder of the Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition, leading Southern Colorado's fight against PFAS contamination since 2016. And she successfully worked on 7 state laws and secured federal funding to protect communities from toxic chemicals. And then finally, we have our moderator for the panel, Ian James, who's a water reporter for the Los Angeles Times. He was previously in Arizona, so in Arizona here, we're very familiar with Ian's work at that time and since then. Ian focuses on water and climate change in California and the West and poses questions that produce distinctive stories and contribute to public debates. And he deeply examines government decisions and corporate practices to expose problems and injustices. So, Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you, the perfect moderator for this panel. And as I indicated, in case people come in late, I will be moderating the chat. We may have time for some questions, in which case I'll turn my camera back on. But otherwise, I turn it over to you, Ian, and the panelists. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and congratulations, Sharon and Rachel, on this superb and important book. It really exposes how pervasive these chemicals are and how far-reaching the effects are. I was struck by the point in reading it that although they're called forever chemicals, they really also are everywhere chemicals. And I'd like to start by asking Sharon if you can talk about some of the basics in terms of what are these chemicals and how have they entered the environment and gotten into our bodies.
Thank you for doing this today, and thank you for joining us, everyone. So PFAS is an acronym for very long term, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. But it's really the acronym for about 15,000 synthetic organofluorines. They're in many household items, such as waterproof fabrics, nonstick pans, cosmetics, as well as certain firefighting foams. And their water and stain resistance have made them incredibly useful in things like medical devices, first responder gear, and in semiconductors. So they have a lot of utility, I do want to point out, and they were invented by accident, but then in 1938. I can get to that in a second. But the problem is with them is that they don't break down in the environment at all. They linger in the human body also by binding to proteins in the blood, and they do so in more than 97% of Americans, according to the CDC. They've also been linked to many cancers and kidney, thyroid, heart, reproductive, and immune issues. And as you can see in the book, we've learned that downstream from heavy discharges, the effects can really be dire. So that's a basic summary of what they are. But I do just want to add that little funny accidental story, funny, I say, is that they were really just birthed by a postdoctoral scholar who was working on hazardous alternatives for hazardous refrigerants in a DuPont lab in New Jersey in 1938. And he was just trying to store cold cylinders of a gas called tetrafluoroethylene, sorry, which is also known as TFE, and he assumed that that gas would remain a gas. But upon opening the cylinders, he found a white powder. That TFE had undergone what's called polymerization, when a carbon-carbon double bond in one TFE breaks apart and attacks others. He found that the powder was heat resistant, and most things did not stick to it. So DuPont then trademarked poly-TFE, or PTFE, or Teflon, in 1944. So I can stop there, but those are some of the basics, the history behind it, and now they are in just so many things.
To jump in very
Right.
quickly, oh, sorry,
go ahead.
just Ian, I feel like you really hit on something when you mentioned that these are also everywhere chemicals. You know, we actually almost called this book Forever and Everywhere. That was our working title. And I just want to emphasize that while folks like Brenda and Mark and Liz have this in their communities to, a greater extent than just about anybody, these are in water systems and groundwater and drinking water across America.
Rachel and Sharon, what led to your decision to work on this book, to work on it together, and what did you hope to discover as you set out on your journey and working on it?
When Sharon was hired to the Hill in 2021, I believe, we both very quickly learned that we just sort of have a fascination with these chemicals. And I think one of the things that for me personally did it was that finding that it was in 97% of Americans. This is not just some sad thing that impacts people far away. This is impacting me and you and probably everyone we know. But so Sharon and I, we worked on a series about some of, the legal aspects of PFAS and sort of the difficulty with, people who are trying to pursue lawsuits because, if I hit you with my car, the cause and effect there is very easy to prove. If I dump chemicals in your water and then, 15 years later you develop an illness, that's a lot more difficult to prove. So that was the crux of our series. And after that, we were like, we want to keep going. Let's do more. Let's keep pursuing this. And that's sort of how the book was born.
And I
It's
just
really
want to add that series of stories was actually kind of inspired by a connection I had made with Mark, who is right here. He had told me a lot of the specific stories that his community underwent and the legal struggle associated with it, and we just found that truly fascinating. So you'll hear some more of that probably later from Mark.
And clearly the effects for people and communities have been devastating. I would like to turn to Brenda, Mark, and Liz. Each of them has seen and known so many people who suffered serious health effects that they link to these chemicals. And that includes themselves, their relatives, and many other people they've known. Brenda, I'd like to start with you and ask, what has driven your journey as an activist, and what are the stories that of how people have been harmed that have motivated you through this?
By me being affected myself by visiting my hometown. I used to live in Boston and I was visiting my hometown, and I had several family relatives to come down with it. My mother, my brother, and two of my sisters to come down with renal failure. And I was away in Boston and I became ill myself. And I found out that I was with renal failure, and the doctors told me it was with toxins material. And I wasn't working with anything that was of toxic nature. So it affected me. I came home. I had people that was in places, and I started looking around to see what did we have in common, because a lot of people was having renal failure and a lot of rare cancers were coming up in the neighborhood. And the only thing that I could find that we had in common was the water. And so I started reaching out, partnering with different organizations, and we had the water tested, and it come back that we had industrial toxins in our drinking water. And our drinking water intake valve is only 13 miles downstream from 27 industrial plants, with 3M being one of the corporates that is involved.
And how are you doing with your health nowadays?
Well, I've had 2 heart attacks, and I just suffered a stroke in June on the bleeding of the brain. I just went to my doctors right now. They feel that I'm returning a little bit healthy on the medication that I am. I still have to watch my diet and watch what I do and watch what I'm exposed to. But I am gaining a little weight now. My nephrologist says he don't anticipate me on going on to dialysis until the next 5 years. I'm 69 now. If I live to see August the 4th of this year, I'll be 70. So I think I've had a good time here on earth, and it's my time if it's my time.
What do you most want people to know about the health effects that sometimes may be hard for them to trace specifically to these chemicals, and what should people do to protect themselves and people in their communities?
Well, in our research and during the research, I stepped in these chemicals behind a plant, which I was on property that I should have been on at the time. I didn't have permission, but it was during my research. And we used the Brockmeyer study that we used, and we found that a lot of people in this community had these illnesses. They had renal failure. We used the 7 studies that they had.
Oh, it looks like we, Brenda, if you can hear us, are you still there?
Connection. Yeah, yes, I lost connection for a minute, but we used the Brockmeyer study, and then I started noticing in the community that a lot of people was coming down with renal failure, prostate cancer, breast cancer. I have four residents that I continue to give medical treatment to. They have babies that is on feeding tubes. And that was something that we found, that in the discovery of these chemicals, that the mice had some of the defects, and we have some residents here that children are born with eye defects. I've been supplying water and medical supplies here, adult diapers, because we have people here that have incontinency. I came out of Massachusetts and gave my mother my left kidney to keep her alive, and she was pain free for 4 years. And then I later came down with renal failure.
Well, I want to turn to Mark, but Brenda first, is there anything else you want to say about your conclusions as to what people in communities can do to protect themselves?
First of all, know that I found in my research that any state that has had any type of industry, you're more than likely to have some type of contamination in your water, in your drinking system. So I would advise you to stay away from that unless you have a reverse osmosis system. It's what I fought very hard for to get in this county. And we now have a reverse osmosis system in this county, but it has caused a lot of deaths and a lot of injuries, and it still continues to go. So just watch out for. If you see something wrong and you feel that it's not right, say something about it and get up and act and do something about it. You could be saving your life and your family's lives.
Thank you. Mark, you testified before Congress in 2019 together with Mark Ruffalo. What was that like, and what points did you most want members of Congress to take away?
It was, be a little bit intimidating. It was very, it was a unique experience. I'm not sure how effective, but the main points that I told wanted Congress to know was that, you know, in our community, the main, source of the contamination was through the AFFF firefighting foam from Peterson Air Force Base. And the main point was that Peterson Air Force Base admitted actually dumping these chemicals into our drinking water source, several times a year for, decades, starting in 1991, while, 15 minutes away, Fort Carson, they decided to remove AFFF toxic, from their environment and their system. So that was one of the main things. And also the fact that, a lot of my family members, there were 15 that had cancer. A lot of them died, with kidney cancer. A lot of these were military veterans. A lot of my cousins, their children were drinking PFAS and their wives laden water while they were on combat tours in Afghanistan. And the last point was that uh, subsequently, a lot of these our family members are buried in military cemeteries. My one cousin PK, he was drafted into the Vietnam War, survived that. My other cousin Shelton King survived, combat tours in Vietnam to be buried, PK in military cemeteries because of drinking water contamination from the United States military. So I think that's something that just, is not acceptable and something that has to be addressed. And then, the final point is currently in our family, we have 5 of our young family members that are serving in the United States Army, Air Force, Marines, and Navy. And so I want to make sure that they're protected because it's part of our family tradition in Colorado Springs to serve in the United States military. So I want to make sure they're protected in the future.
Yeah, the number of people who've experienced the health effects in your family is just, it's so much. And there's been so much loss that you've gone through. It seems like one of the responses of society in the face of this type of contamination is often litigation, but is that can't really be it can't really repay these losses, right?
No.
What do you think is important about accountability for what has occurred?
I think it's very important for accountability because in my family, one of my aunts had 15 kids. That's why, and our family chose to live close to each other. A couple of my aunts lived right behind each other, so we're a very close knit family. And I think that you know, born and raised in a strong matriarchy, and to have a lot of my grandparents, my aunts, grandmothers die, that has a devastating effect on the family that is just priceless. That's why I told them in Congress that, as far as my grandmother, there's not enough money in the U.S. Treasury to compensate. So I think that, we have to have accountability in order to prevent these things from happening because the damages are just too numerous, and you just can't put a price on or tabulate the effect that happens, when your mother, your aunt, your grandmother, when these people are deceased or suffering kidney cancer. One of my cousins, he had to have his kidneys just immediately failed at 14 and had to have a kidney transplant. And his mother lived in the contamination area for 10 years, and doctors ruled that it wasn't genetic. So she had to find a kidney for her son. And these things, you just can't put numbers or prices on the damage and that these things cause.
What do you most want to see the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and the manufacturers that were responsible for them do?
One, I think it has to be, accountability, acknowledge and accept their role in this contamination. And I think we also have to have a serious, concrete, uh, nonpartisan, bipartisan plan moving forward on how to prevent prevent this contamination. Because right now, even if they do go ahead and regulate the handful of chemicals that they're trying to, there's over like 5,000 PFAS. So I think the key thing right now is to do prevention. And, like I always tell people, if I wanted to go to the local drugstore and sell PFAS in a bottle as an elixir, the FDA, the federal government, would require that we do years and years of study to prove that it's safe. Meanwhile, since PFAS are unregulated legally, we're allowed to dump millions and millions of these chemicals into our drinking water sources. So that just makes no sense whatsoever, and is very, hypocritical and a double standard. So I think the key thing we need to do is find a way to prevent these by having people having to prove these chemicals are safe before they're allowed to allow them to enter the drinking water of Americans.
Thank you. Liz, I'd like to ask you about your personal journey in terms of discovering the harms of these chemicals and what you decided to do about it.
Yes, happy Earth Day. And thank you for this incredible book written by Sharon and Rachel. It's a history of resilience, and in 2016, there was a newspaper article that our water was poisoned and our water district managers were not even informed. So there was a giant community meeting that did not go over well with everyone. And at the time, I had been running for a county commissioner seat for an election because I live, outside of city limits and now pretty rural. And then nothing was done after that. So the day after elections that I lost, my husband, it was late at night. My husband's like, well, look at the people who did vote for you, go fix the water. And then he fell asleep. I got out a notebook and I started listing all of my ideas just as fast and furious as I could. And then I met with some friends at my house. We ate spaghetti dinner and we just started talking about, well, what can we do? And that has turned into just an incredible advocacy for our community. We came up with the name Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition, and I dropped the link in the chat. We organized as people. We're not a nonprofit. We're a Facebook page so we can get our information out. And since then, we have passed 7 state laws. We go to Mark and Brenda and I, we go to national PFAS conferences where we meet other coalition leaders that you're going to read about in this book. At the time, I felt like I was pretty healthy, but these chemicals are forever chemicals. They're persistent. And my husband now really understands what I'm doing. At first, he's like, oh, there's Liz going off and organizing something again. And, now that he's been participating more, he realizes his health effects are from PFAS. And in 2009, he almost died. We didn't know why. And then I had the same exact thing just a couple of days after our PFAS conference in 2022. And then talking with Sharon and Brenda and some other people, what happened to us is common, but we're not included in any of the litigation. So my goal is to make poisoning people more expensive to industry than for them to do the right thing.
Where do you think the medical profession is in being able to link health problems to PFAS in your experience and what you've read about these issues, Liz?
The medical community is absolutely missing. Where I live in El Paso County, say south of Platte. So El Paso County is pretty big, but south of Platte, we don't have any hospitals. We just got a UC Health doctor's office built, and they have positions for 4 doctors and no doctors. By having no medical care available to us, because we're extremely expensive, it doesn't look good for a bottom dollar of shareholders. They force us up north. We're supposed to be excited about pathetic, and that's unacceptable to me. So we will be poisoned again. Our community is a sacrifice zone. We've experienced 5 major water poisonings here with massive filtration systems. Colorado is a first source water for all the states around us that don't have first source water. So the water that we have here in El Paso County starts off as snowmelt, groundwater aquifers, and it goes through over 800 water filtration facilities before it reaches the Gulf of Mexico. And it is devastating to think that industry is okay with poisoning a community. It's unacceptable for industry to say, oh, but we give you jobs, you should be thankful. And, you know, I had a young friend pass away in 2022, and I asked where she was raised because it was a military community. She was raised at an Air Force base in New Mexico, and she died of blood cancer. And I don't even think she really realized what she had because she thought she had the flu, went into a coma, and died about 10 hours later.
Just want to ask you to clarify the sources of PFAS in your community. You mentioned 5 major poisonings. Of course, for Brenda and her area, there were manufacturing facilities. Tell me about the geography of your area and where these chemicals have come from and how they've gotten into water and the environment.
Sure. So El Paso County has 5 military bases, and Fountain Valley is sandwiched between Fort Carson on the west, and then on the east side is Peterson Air Force Base, which is now Space Base. I've learned so much from him because of his military and healthcare background. The DoD said, hey, stop using these chemicals at all DoD locations. But Peterson played semantics. I find that this is very common. So Peterson did all of their airplane maneuvers, practicing with AFFF foam, aqueous film forming foam. We started calling it toxic firefighting foam to get people's attention. And it was overused. It was for fun, but the chemical manufacturers lied about it and said, hey, it's a surfactant like soap. Look, it's pretty, it's fluffy, it's fine. And then a 10,000 gallon storage facility was then used to store it. And Colorado Springs Utilities, just north of us, the big city here, gave permits to dump it into Fountain Creek. So in a military community, families move in and out every three years. So with it being done at the Colorado Springs Airport, it was not a DoD facility, so they continued using it by playing semantics over and over and over. And when it was announced in 2016 that, hey, this stuff is really deadly, somebody accidentally drained that 10,000 gallon storage facility before regulations went into place. And there's a lot of things that happen to hurry up and get rid of the evidence. So the people who do live here, long-termers like me or Mark's family, I've been here 25 years, we are walking pieces of human evidence of a crime against humanity. We don't have healthcare, we don't have justice, but we can fight back with litigation and legislation.
I did want to ask you about what legislation has been passed in Colorado and what that has done as far as starting to regulate or limit these chemicals. And also, is Colorado, I get the sense it's been somewhat ahead of other states. Maybe you can talk about that and share what stands out about what Colorado has done so far.
Right. I think what stands out the most is the unity that coalition leaders have done across the United States and how we have the opportunity to meet every other year for a conference. And we put together ideas, hey, this is what we're going to do. We were told in the beginning, you can't ban PFAS chemicals, you can't regulate it. We said, yes, we can. We are changing the rules. There are rules and we're going to change them. And in the very first bill, so we started the Water Coalition in 2016. It took us a couple of years to understand what PFAS was. We're all busy working people, right? Like, we don't have time to do the amount of research. We don't have the back. I'm not a scientist or a chemist. So Colorado College came in and they taught us. These college kids taught us at our monthly meetings what PFAS chemicals were, how the water systems work. So by 2019, we were able to get a bill passed to ban these chemicals at airports and some other places. Lots and lots of pushback. And the oil and gas company did the right thing, or a good thing, and said every gas truck that drives through Colorado, we're going to pay a $25 fee. So it took me 9 years, and the small water district where I live has just been hooked up with PFAS filtration. And we're waiting for the all clear because it just got hooked up. It's got to run for a while, do some testing, monitoring of it. The bill 6 and 7 that we did should have been done in one bill, like Minnesota. That was the one that it bans PFAS from consumer goods, like your disposable coffee cups, your makeup, your child care, your child products. Like, why did we have fire-resistant baby clothes? I mean, I get it, kids are kind of dirty, but I don't think they're like spontaneously combust, right? There's so many ways that the industry just kind of blindsided us. And when I was, when my kids were little, I used to use Scotch Guard. I'd put my shirt over my nose and spray the inside of the family tent before we went out camping, or I'd spray their new Bob the Builder and, Hello Kitty shoes to make them last longer. And I didn't know. Pots and pans, all these things I didn't know. But I think when we had that meeting and I heard the rage of my community, and that I knew I was good at least getting people together to talk about a problem, that we really started to solve it.
Right.
And I'm still teaching people how to go up and be a regular person, be your own lobbyist. And the last bill that we did for the state of Colorado, the biggest spender lobbyist was a chemical manufacturer. So there were like 800 bills and lobbyists. Half the money spent by a lobbyist was by the chemical manufacturers. So we must be doing something right if they're that scared about us. I'm making this as expensive as possible for them.
Thank you. Well, I want to get to the history because there is a long history with these chemicals. But first, I want to ask Sharon, can we recap why were these chemicals developed and what properties do they have that make them attractive and a product for these companies?
So some of it I mentioned a little bit before, that the chemicals were actually an accidental invention, which, as we said, started in 1938, and then DuPont trademarked PTFE, Teflon, in 1944. That Teflon very quickly appealed to the US military because it was resistant to heat and corrosion, and it didn't interact with other chemicals. So one of its first uses was actually to contain highly reactive materials like uranium in the making of the atomic bomb. Teflon really only reached consumers, actually, thanks to an inventor across the world in France. His name was Marc Gregoire. And he started coating his own pans with Teflon and then launched the company Tefal in Rumilly, a town in France, in 1956. And then Tefal began exporting its products to the US in 1961, which became popular in no small part thanks to a photograph of Jackie Kennedy purchasing a pan. So that was really like the popularization. But just to get back to some of the properties really quickly, these were stain resistant, they were waterproof. And again, they estimate there are up to about 15,000 of them at this point, and they're all man-made. They all perform a slightly different function, which may seem similar to us on the surface. But they have utility, and I keep going back to that because there is a reason that they became so popular. Some of them have like critical utility in medical devices. Others are just a matter of convenience. You know, people like that when they go on a hike in the snowy mountains, that their boots are waterproof. So they just took on this popularity among consumers. People liked them, and people also have trouble parting with them because they don't realize that there are communities like Brenda's who are suffering because of the discharges of the concentrated versions of these chemicals.
Right. Rachel, I wanted to ask you about the history in terms of when the manufacturers became aware of these health effects and what was discovered. And the same for the government. When did it become apparent that there were real problems affecting human health, and um, what did they learn, those early discoveries?
So there's been evidence both on the government side and on the corporate side for decades of the toxicity, especially the corporate side. I apologize about the ambulance in the background, I guess city living. But so in the 60s, DuPont, which is one of the historic, users of PFAS, they had studies, or they had documents from the 60s calling it hazardous and finding that, it could harm animals, and creating organ damage and tumors, In the 70s, there was evidence, and, we know that 3M was aware of this, that it was building up in human beings, not just human beings in their own factories, but human beings, they were finding evidence of this in the general population. For the government, the picture is a little bit more complicated because the FDA, old documents that I found show, had some evidence of this in the 60s, that they were, or even the late 50s, that they had evidence that this could, cause tumors under, skin of rats. Teflon embedded under the skin of rats could cause tumors. But, the EPA didn't even exist until 1970. And, when we passed our first chemicals law in 1976, pretty much everything that was already in use was grandfathered in. So the EPA didn't really get its arms around this, or didn't really have any idea of the scope of the problem probably until the late 90s.
And it is striking how long it has taken. I mean, there are lots of parallels. Climate action. We've known about the dangers for a long time, right? And it's not one simple thing, but what do you think stands out in your research on what has taken so long for there to be action on this?
I think, government, especially at the federal level, moves slow. And until very recently, any chemical that was going out onto the market, any new chemical, it was pretty much innocent until proven guilty, right? If you're proven guilty, okay, maybe we don't let this onto the market, or maybe we take it off of the market. But, until it was proven guilty, it was innocent. And so there's a lot of toxic chemicals out there, PFAS and otherwise, that we use. And, that's just kind of a slow process. And our laws and our regulations have been evolving. Part of it was that the EPA wasn't notified about at least the buildup and the omnipresence of this until the late 90s. And, politics also certainly play a factor, right? Across the board, making things more expensive by requiring regulations can be unpopular, and that can be difficult for any administration. I think generally, and especially we're seeing this at the state level and in Congress, Democrats are more eager to act than Republicans. Again, generally, there are some Republicans who have been eager as well, and there are some Democrats who really have not moved, but across the board, I think that Democrats are more eager to regulate and act. But I think it's sort of a mix of knowledge, of politics, of circumstance, all those things.
Yeah, you write, as you trace the history, that at one point, I believe it was around 2009, that even after a lot of research had come out, that the subject was put on the back burner during a change in administrations. That it's been a long road. Rachel or Sharon, maybe you both have thoughts on this. How would you summarize for people where the process of regulating this stands at the federal level?
So under the Biden administration, there was, immense change. Two major regulations passed that, are a big deal, but at the same time also do not tackle the entire scope of the problem. So the biggest one is probably the drinking water regulations passed under the Biden administration. Those require water systems to test for PFAS. And if they find PFAS, it requires them by 2029 to install water filtration. And, it only applies to 6 PFAS out of thousands. However, the technologies that filter out those 6 might also be useful in getting out some or all of the others. We are seeing in some places some of that technology. There are some PFAS slipping through some of the granulated activated carbon filtration systems, but on the whole, that is a big deal. And if that regulation stays in place, and that is a big if, that could make a big difference in, the exposure to every single person. But, we still don't have, discharge limits. Companies are still allowed to dump this stuff into the water and into the air. And, we have not seen action on that. And it's not clear whether, the Biden era rules will stay in place or whether they'll stay as they are. The Trump administration has not said, whether they plan to keep the rule in place, weaken it, cut it entirely. And so we're all kind of waiting on that.
What I would add to that is I think that it's my opinion that the onus is going to be more on the states if something does happen within the Trump administration. And you already see some action occurring, like California, which did not regulate PFAS on its own, has introduced some legislation regarding kind of setting in stone the Biden era regulations on a state level. So I just think, yeah, again, just personal opinion, that the states are going to really have the choice of stepping up or not. But one last thing, I think that goes to show that a lot of both PFAS contamination and legislation, regulation, it's so location dependent, and people didn't choose where to live based on whether they were going to be contaminated or not. So I just think that's an interesting point, because someone in Alabama might be affected in a whole different way than someone in California or Colorado.
Sharon, you mentioned in the book that there are more than 10,000 different chemicals that fall under this class of chemicals, and there are only several of them that have fallen under these preliminary government regulations and proposals. Is that an issue, that there are many chemicals out there that are not even close to being regulated? Or
well, I think it's an issue that's become really politicized, and a lot of scientists, most scientists that deal with these compounds that we speak to would be in favor of regulating them as a class, but industry is very much against that. So I can't tell you the individual risk of every single compound. They all have different toxicity, they have different effects. Many have not been studied at all, but I can just tell you that there is that dispute between scientists and politicians on how they should be regulated.
And let's talk about the technological solutions. Are there some fail-safe solutions that remove all of these chemicals if they are installed in water treatment systems?
So there are 3 main types of removal technologies that are being used now. One is granular activated carbon, which Rachel mentioned earlier. That's when carbon-based materials just like trap the PFAS. Raw water rushes through, and the PFAS is attracted to the material and fills the pores of a sponge. Then there's reverse osmosis, which is in Brenda's community, in which a semi-permeable membrane bars PFAS and other contaminants from passing through. And then the third is called ion exchange. I saw this in Colorado, and the Department of Defense is actually paying for it there, in which something called a resin is dotted with positively charged beads that are soaked in salt water, and they attract negatively charged chloride ions. And then when PFAS polluted water is added, the negatively charged PFAS ions swap places with the chloride, which binds to sodium in the water to regenerate non-harmful salt and PFAS-laden resin. Now, That's an important point, that in all three of these removal technologies, you are left with concentrated PFAS. So the PFAS just becomes someone else's problem, either sent to a landfill, well, toxic waste, hopefully, or incinerated. But we do have some room for hope on that front, because there are scientists in laboratories across the world who have really actually developed methods to degrade these compounds. I like to call it breaking the unbreakable. And some of them are starting to come to at least pilot level commercial scale. And they are able to break them down into harmless byproducts, but it's all about money and bringing that to scale. And because as we began this conversation, we said this is not just a forever problem, but an everywhere problem, and these are everywhere. So it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of those technologies to be developed at scale in order to really clean up this problem. But the science exists, and that's something that I think we can feel hopeful about.
Brenda, I'd like to turn back to you and ask about the situation in your community now. Is the water clean?
Yes, we have a reverse osmosis system. We've been online for 2 years now. I've had the water tested since residing back in Alabama. I've had it tested from the kitchen sink where I reside from at the U-Farms lab in Sacramento, California, and it came back no detect for any type of chemicals. At the same time, I had a couple of wells tested around in this area that did come back for PFAS contamination and several other different contaminants in personal wells. So that let me know if it's working.
What else do you think needs to be done in your area and other communities to find these chemicals where they exist to reduce the threats to human health and the environment?
Well, currently I'm working on a bill to try to get our governor to rescind these permits, because the former governor that we had, Robert Bentley, he was letting these plants dump over 1 million pounds of this stuff into the toxic waste into the Tennessee River. So we're trying to do that to get that overturned so that we can have clean and safe water. Because again, they take the PFAS out and they're using it for fertilizer here on the biosludge. It's another problem that we have here because they give a lot of farmers, this is a rural area, they give it to them for free fertilizer, telling them that it will yield more product, grow faster, and the whole 9 yards. And it's still contaminating the community. So we're working on that as well with the bill for the biosludge.
Yeah, that stands out as a real problem, and it's detailed in the book. Mark, what do you think are some of the solutions that you see as most promising?
Well, I think, one thing that's, kind of been underscored is, the corporates are one thing, but the problem when, when the DOD, United States, the federal government is the polluter is one, it's hard to hold them accountable because they have legal immunity, and a lot of the bills that even passed in Colorado, they get exceptions. And when Sharon talks about state solutions, even in Colorado, as in Michigan and other states, the Pentagon has said in writing that they will not even comply with a lot of the state regulations for PFAS. So I think that's one of the big problems. So I think what we have to decide as Americans is, do we want to allow do we want to give like the federal government a pass when they're the main polluter? Because I think, we have to be able to, find a way to hold them accountable, because until we have that, they'll just keep, this problem will keep on occurring. And like, even here in Peterson, we don't even know what the status of the investigation is, because by federal law, any pollution contamination that starts on a military base or Department of Energy, the EPA is not allowed to lead the investigation. The United States military leads the investigation. So that's why it takes forever and ever. So we need transparency and accountability, for as the first step.
Liz, would you have thoughts to add on the whole subject of solutions and what you would most like to see?
Yeah, so I was just typing something I'll put in the chat here. We have a local family park that was built for water poisoning that happened in the 80s to off-gas mercury poisoning, and it's got high levels of PFAS, some of the highest in the state. And our county commissioners were continuing to host kid fishing derbies, and up until 2023. And there are still no warning signs. And I was just there a week ago. So I'm trying to rally some kids to be advocates for themselves. I've got a field trip for kiddos coming up in May for one of our local giant water districts. It was a big filtration facility built by Army Corps of Engineers and run by our current water district managers. And then I'm going to see if they are willing to take on the task of holding the adults accountable here. So there's just, it seems like we have a lot of movement, but it is definitely a political. It shouldn't be political. It should be, hey, there's poisons here. Let's not let kids fish and eat the fish. I mean, that's just common sense, but yet that's a fight we have to do.
And I have a question for anyone here. If you have thoughts about what people can do on a personal level, if they don't know, in their community, what the levels of PFAS might be, or if they aren't aware of, what some of the potential dangers are, how can people learn more about this and protect themselves and their communities?
I always just do a Google search before I go somewhere. I type the name of the city in PFAS. And you're going to find an incredible amount of information done by people like Sharon. I mean, even on Saturday when we had a celebration, Ian with Green Latinos made the connection. He's like, oh, that's the Sharon that I always read all her articles. And she wrote this book, and everybody knows everybody through, a small world. So meeting people in person, I think, is definitely a way that we can combat this quicker and have bigger solutions.
I would add, I always take a look at it's the Environmental Working Group's tap water database. And like before, it's just kind of they made a collection of data. It's not their data. They drew from all kinds of local water utilities, government data of water. And before I travel anywhere, I always take a look and see like what the PFAS levels and other contaminant levels are in that area, so I can decide like how I want to drink my water while traveling. So it's just one tool of many, but I use it very often.
Right. Brenda, do you have other thoughts about what you want people to take away on this subject? What you think is most important for discussions going forward about these chemicals?
Again, to watch your community, watch where you live, as Liz and as Sharon and the fellow panelists that said, always check about the PFAS in the area that you're going into. And don't be afraid to have conversations with the members of your communities. If you're friends with the people that's in your neighborhood, talk to them, find out if someone has illnesses that might be rare or unusual. And then you start looking around, because on 2 streets here, I found 54 cases of cancer, 11 cases of autism, and 14 cases of renal failure, just by going door to door and talking to the people in the community. So you can make a difference by going and finding out. And then you will find that you have a problem in your community and you can do something about it.
I would like to mention that Professor Lal from Arizona State University points out in the chat that I would suggest that people consider using kitchen under-counter reverse osmosis filtration systems. This is an inexpensive solution, generally about $200, for ensuring safety from PFAS and other contaminants of concern.
It's okay. One other thing I would chime in with here is that, part of our exposure comes from drinking water, but, for average people, obviously, Brenda and Mark and Liz have a special case where their water has been contaminated, but just for sort of your everyday American, a lot of our exposure comes from just our use of products, and I personally, I think, am most concerned about products that you can either ingest or inhale, or it can get into your body or your bloodstream. So that's things like dental floss. You should look for PFAS-free floss, because if you floss and you bleed, then you're putting PFAS into your bloodstream. It's cookware. I've swapped my nonstick for stainless steel. You can also do cast iron. So just sort of for the everyday folks among us who are not necessarily, dealing with the issues with their water, or at least not particularly problematic issues with their water, I would just note that for average Americans, a lot of our exposure can come from sort of these everyday products that we use as well.
Is this stuff still being manufactured? It seems like there's been a real phasing out in various industries, but where is it still being used?
So two of the most notorious, most well-studied, and most harmful PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, are not really being manufactured in the US anymore. I mean, there might be a few small cases, but it's not as widespread, certainly, as it once was. But there are thousands of these things, and when one goes away, more crop up, and we sort of have to start all over again studying, does this have health effects? If so, what are they? And so, yeah, they are still being manufactured broadly in the US, even if PFOA and PFOS are not.
And again, let's recap. What do drinking water regulations say about PFAS in drinking water at this point? And what is proposed down the line?
So, well, first of all, drinking water regulations, I want to add, only apply to public water systems. If you're on a private well, your water is pretty much unprotected, because there's no limits on what, at least for PFAS, what can be discharged, right? So the companies can still keep dumping stuff, and it can still get in your water if you're not on a water system. But there are now these binary regulations that will require PFAS to be filtered out if it's detected. We're still sort of in the phase where companies are having to sort of start, or water utilities, if they're public or private, are going to have to start testing for PFAS. And if they have PFAS, they're going to have to filter them out, unless the Trump administration makes those changes, and we will see what happens there.
I want to do a quick piggyback off that. Public drinking water systems also has a semantics level to it. Where I live, we only have 425 taps, so it flew under the radar until we used our first grant to get $410,000 to add in filtration. And also with the DoD, they get to determine where the barrier is, or the line of the district that they poison. And then they fight with, well, we didn't poison all the way down in Liz's area. And we're like, well, that's PFXS, PFHXS, and that's AFFF firefighting foam. So yeah, you did. Water is connected. So it's important that we make sure we have regulations that are enforceable, because advisories are, kind of what we had here. And once there were regulations of non-detect, then something has to be done, instead of like, it's not that bad because it's just an advisory.
Right. Well, I would like to thank all of you for this conversation. I think it's really important for the public, and it's the points that you brought out are so important. And also thanks to our audience for joining us. I know that Rachel and Sharon will be doing more reporting on this as well, so they would welcome your emails with any additional questions. So does anyone else have any other parting thoughts?
I mean, to pick up on
Go ahead.
no,
Go
I
ahead.
just say, I continue to cover this for my day job at the Hill. Sharon continues to cover these issues, and I've dropped our emails and my Signal and Sharon's personal email in the chat, if that's helpful to anybody.
I just wanted to thank everyone for who attended today, because I think every person that learns about this issue can share it with someone else. And I've started speaking about the book a bit, and every time I meet with people who actually never heard of PFAS before and want to know what they can do about it. So I'm just really glad that you all came and are interested in educating yourself about this subject.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hey, everyone.